Alrighty, welcome back in, everyone. We just talked about the Pac-12 and how they're kind of going on the offensive to get some of the teams. They got to get up to 8 teams before 2026, so it'll be really interesting to watch how that develops. I apologize, my hair is a little bit all over the place, but that's all good now. But let's get into segment 2 here, and let's talk about who can actually win the national title. One of the things that has kind of popped up over the last decade or so has been this thing called blue chip ratio. It was introduced in 2013, I believe, and Bud Elliott over at CBS did a great job helping us answer the question of just how important it is. And it is really important, it seems. Every single national champion that has won since 2013 when it was introduced has been at least over 50% on the blue chip ratio. So essentially what that means is you recruit more 4 and 5 stars than you do 2 and 3 stars. That's really kind of the moniker. The elite teams obviously bring in tons of 4 and 5 stars, and then you have some teams that live off that 3 stars and maybe a 4 star here and there. So obviously this gives you an idea of who's recruiting at a really high level, but also who has the depth, who has the talent to possibly make those runs into national title contention. And it's held up over the last little bit. Now, there have been some exceptions. Michigan won last year with only 54%, so barely over the moniker. The lowest ever was Clemson in 2016 with 52, so Florida State did it in 2013 with 53. So it gives you an idea that this is not necessarily you have to be well over this mark, but 50% has kind of become the moniker, at least going forward. Now, TCU and Washington obviously did away with that last season and the season before with getting into the dance, and we'll talk about possibly who could do that this upcoming year right after this in the next segment. But let's get into the teams that make the cut. Let's get into the teams that, hypothetically, if we were to follow this ironclad, they can win the national title. And there are a couple of teams on here that you're going to be surprised by. There are a couple of teams that aren't on here that you're going to be surprised by. But the biggest one that I would just have to start with is 90% of Ohio State's roster being blue chip guys is absolutely ridiculous. It is insanity. I don't know if there's ever been a number that high because Lord, it's insane what they have on that roster. Alabama is still Alabama. I apologize to anyone that thought this was not a talented roster. They are still ridiculous across the board. They are going to be incredible this year, and I think the only real thing I'm worried about is, does Jalen Milroe take the next step? If he does, it's not a problem. Georgia's exactly where you expect them to be. Texas A&M still has a ton of talent from that class that they brought in a couple of years ago. Obviously, some big-time guys have left, Walter Nolan, Evan Stewart, but there's still plenty of really talented guys in that room, Connor Wegman being chief among them. Oregon, Oklahoma, Texas, all kind of in the same boat right there. Oklahoma being higher than Texas on this is actually a little bit surprising to me. There's still a little bit of recruiting that has to be done on Texas' end to fix some of the problems that were there when Steve Sarkisian showed up. But at the same time, Brent Venables walked into a situation that didn't necessarily have the greatest talent, or at least the greatest talent in terms of what he actually needed. I think they had plenty of 4 and 5 stars. They didn't necessarily have the 4 and 5 stars where you needed them on the roster. So it's kind of an interesting thing to watch. LSU's right where you expect them to be. Notre Dame the same. Clemson hanging out. They're still recruiting at a very high level. There's no doubt about that. Florida's team is much better than people are giving them credit for. Obviously, Miami, as we all know, has been recruiting at a really high level under Mario Cristobal over the last little bit. Penn State's right there with them. USC, Michigan, and Auburn round out this list. So Auburn making it at 53%. There's a chance, guys. Down there in Auburn, Alabama, you might be a little bit excited right now. So the one glaring missing team is Florida State, obviously. They're right outside with 49%, so take that with what you will. Tennessee's at 46%. Missouri misses this list. Don't exactly know where they are. And the entirety of the Big 12 misses this list. So Utah, Kansas State, Kansas, Oklahoma State, they're all living off some less talented rosters. And then obviously Ole Miss not being on this list is a very interesting one. Now, I thought if we factored in transfers, it would add them to this list. It doesn't, which is the very interesting thing. But overall, you have 13 of the 16 from the SEC and the Big Ten, 8 SEC, 5 Big Ten, 1 independent with Notre Dame, 2 ACC, and then none from the Big 12. So that's the sport right now. That's just another idea of how much this sport has kind of split down the middle. But let's get into kind of a different conversation because we talked about Ole Miss and how they brought in so much talent through the transfer portal. And what if we added transfer portal talent to this kind of moniker? And how does that kind of change things for teams? Frankly, everyone drops just a little bit. For the most part, everyone kind of takes a little bit of a step down. The one team that takes a big step up is that Florida State team. They get into the hunt with that. They get above that 53% with some of the guys they brought in. You know, Malik Benson's very talented coming out of high school. Roy Dell Williams, the same exact thing. Terrence Ferguson, all from Bama. They're going to be high-level recruits. So definitely they get into the hunt there. This is probably the list that I would point at the most if I were to look at this upcoming season, just because of how many transfer portal teams there really are out there. There's going to be so many relying on that. But there's a couple that didn't change at all. Clemson obviously did not budge. Michigan barely budged. I don't think they budged at all, really. USC takes a little step down. Most of these teams take a little step down just because you bring in guys that maybe weren't, 4 or 5 stars coming out of high school, but had great first couple of years, and you feel totally confident about them going forward. So the biggest ones here, obviously, Oklahoma and A&M took a pretty significant drop in this, but they brought in, Oklahoma brought in Deion Burks, and Deion Burks was a 3-star coming out of high school. He is not a 3-star talent, at least as of right now. I can promise you that. That kid is an absolute game changer, and I expect him to be a big-time player. And then Solomon DeShields for A&M. I think he's going to be a huge player coming from Pitt. He was a 3-star coming out of high school. So some of this is, take it with a grain of salt. You're picking up some players that, maybe they weren't as highly recruited coming out of high school, but the talent's there. There's no two ways about that for a lot of these kids. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. The teams that I'm, really zeroing in on in terms of how important this is and kind of the teams that stand out the best, I suppose, are, to me, USC being on this list is a little bit surprising just because of a lot of the changes that have happened up there over the last couple of years, whether that's, they brought in a ton of talent early on, but there was that little bit of worry that you were going to have enough guys go out where it was going to kind of be negligible. They were able to kind of get over this moniker. Florida, obviously, being in this list might surprise some people. This is a really talented roster. There's no two ways about that. I've said it time and again that this is a team that they could go 7-5, and I would comfortably say they're a top 20, 15 team in the country. So it's kind of that you have that kind of back and forth between yourself, and I definitely will as I'm trying to make picks on this team because they are incredibly tough to pin down, especially in that Week 1 game against Miami. But as I'm kind of looking at this, and as I'm really looking at these two lists, Ole Miss is nowhere to be found, and they're one of the teams with the most hype and talent going into the season. But let's be honest, when you're bringing in, 35 guys one cycle, 35 guys another, and the same amount essentially are walking out, you're going to have kind of a battle between the two. Kind of what I thought was going to happen with USC, but it actually happened to Ole Miss. So it's not necessarily to say they don't have that talent, but they aren't above that moniker. So maybe if you have that bet set on Ole Miss to win the title, I'm not saying rethink it, but just give it a thought, I suppose. There's definitely some different things to kind of consider here, and I think the biggest thing for me is the moniker has been 50%, and I fully understand that that's probably a good way to go about business. I think this is going to rise over the next couple of years. There's going to be more games to be played. There's going to be more batter on your body. You're going to need more guys in the second and third string to step up and play big minutes. And the only real way you can do that at a very high level is to have guys in the back end that are 4 and 5 stars that are ready to go pretty much right away, or even if they're not ready to go, they have some prerequisite physical ability to kind of fall back on. So it's kind of going to be an interesting thing to watch. I think this is a moniker that it's 50% right now. I could see in 5 years, everyone is above 60% that have won this. And frankly, when I look at this list, I would say that this was going to come from the top half of this list, roughly. Maybe you cut it at Notre Dame and up. I don't want to make any sweeping declarations right now, but the reality is I do think this is going to go up even more because I think talent and depth is more important now in college football than it really ever has been. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch this unfold and see if this upholds. But let's get into to what happens if this doesn't unfold. What happens if this doesn't go the way that everyone thinks it's going to go, and one of the most talented teams in the country wins the title, and that's the end of it? What if someone kind of spoils the party? And we've seen it over the last 2 years. Washington and TCU were well below the 50% moniker that you needed to win a national title, and they made it all the way there. And obviously, neither of those games went the way that they wanted them to, but it doesn't change the fact that someone could spoil this party, and I really want to get into a couple of teams that I'm watching incredibly closely as we get into this, because I think there's a couple of teams, I'm going to do one from each conference, but I could probably name 10 if I needed to, that absolutely could be the Washington or TCU of this year, win a ton of close games, and you look up in week 11 or week 10 and they're undefeated or they have one loss, and you're thinking, is this a playoff team? Is this a team that actually can make a run? And they definitely can be. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold, but let's break down who I think could possibly do that and who I think could maybe buck this trend possibly this upcoming year right after this. So stick with us.